If you would turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. I finally found somebody that speaks longer than I do, and it's Uncle Tom. Loved it. There's a passage in the Bible that this lesson, in fact, was prepared for a different audience, but the principle for me has been such an amazing event that occurred today, and one often wonders the passing of somebody so young, and one often questions and says, is anything good that comes from it? Today, a few people spoke to each other that hadn't spoken to each other for years, hadn't greeted, just was angry with each other. Somebody that has been away for about 20 years has come back and started to talk to somebody else, and hopefully will be trying to work on reconciliation in the family. So God is good, and a wonderful person like Janine had to give a life so that others could have life. A lot of the young folk apparently started to look at their lives differently, and had spoken to her mom and said that her passing had really impacted their life. And so one often wonders just how much we don't know about that God works for good. I mean, there's the little ones we know about, but God works amazing things for good. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9 is an amazing passage that really and truly meant so much to me when I was studying it for a different audience within a different context. But I hope tonight, as we read through it, we'll pick up some of the gems that are in it. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, so that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." And here is where I want to say amen. Once we were not a people, but now we are a people of God. Once we had not received mercy, but now we have received mercy. And this text specifically speaks to me and my heart very loudly, and I hope it'll speak to you as well in a very special way. It's a passage that often speaks to us and is intended to encourage. But when we speak about being God's exclusive property and a nation after God's own heart, what does that mean? What would the purpose clause in that passage be? Well, the purpose clause in there is that so that we may declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. The purpose that we must do is to be able to declare things that the world, had it not been for us, would never experience. There's a topic that's very close to my heart, and I want to say that just talking about that, I want to get to that a bit later, but I want to speak about a text that for me means so much as well. I'm sure it does for you. If you want to ask the world, who are you? How would you really know who is a Christian and who is not? I'm sure right off the top of your head you will say, I would look at the behavior, I would look at the way they treat each other, but I'll also look at the way that they treat people outside, and you'll be spot on. Because Jesus made a comment. In John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35, he said, there is a discernible quality within my people, and the quality is the following, that they truly and utterly love one another. He says, a new commandment I give you, that you must love one another. By this you are known to be my disciples, if you love one another. It's interesting that it's got nothing to do with what our doctrinal convictions are. Not that that's not important. In fact, those are crucial. But that we know what they are, what God's word is saying, but more so that we practice them. The topic I want to speak about tonight, and very briefly, is about forgiveness. When you speak about forgiveness, many of us cringe because it is one of the toughest things to give, but it's also one of the toughest things to receive and ask for. But it's one of the most sanctifying moments to enter into that holy space and say that trusting God and loving God is important in my life. But there's even a greater importance, and that is reconciliation to people. When we look at our world around us, and I'm just going to use the Pistorius example, and I'm not here nor there with regards to anything that people are alleging at the moment, but we're sitting with a man that there was a tragic event and 2 people's lives were irreversibly altered. 2 children in families' lives were absolutely, you can call it, destroyed. And I think our nature is to almost go the movie way, where we says the bad guy gets caught and the good guy gets away. But does it really work that way? We often wonder, and we say within the family of God, and more so within this chosen nation, when we speak about justice, we have a human view on things. And when we speak about justice, we would say the following, is that I will take you to court and so will happen. Well, interestingly enough, we find that Mr. Dewani might be going home soon. And so the issue on the table is that justice might, in our view, or what people desire, might not be seen. There's an old legal adage, and I'm not even sure who quoted it, that said, justice not seen is justice denied. But in this case, when we talk within the Christian framework, we speak about something far deeper, and that about forgiving other people. Let's look at a few things that sometimes cause us to struggle to really forgive. And some of the comments I have heard within that particular context for which the lesson was prepared was, if I continue to forgive, I'll have to be constantly pushed around, and I must be content with that. What if he wrongs my children? We have to let him know that we are not going to stand for it, and we will deal with him in a very firm way, and this is the way it's going to be. If I continue that's the third one, if I continue forgiving other people, it makes me appear weak, and I can't take a stand, hence I'm going to stay with my action as it is at the moment. If I forgive this person, they're going to get away with treating me like this, and no one else will know what they did. And the list goes on and on, where we try to justify the idea of withholding forgiveness, withholding the idea of let's talk it through, let's go through the cross, and let's deal with this thing. Many times people will say that, well, I don't have to forgive. Let me explain. It has to do with a change in our society, where many of our society would say, well, if anybody hurts you, you simply just walk away, never to see them again, and that would also be appropriate. But what is the excellencies of God? What is Peter 2 speaking about? What is that really that he speaks about? A world that is not in darkness, a world that is in light, a world that is screaming out for relief, for release, for reconciliation. I want to just touch on a few things, that aspects of God that I found. And number one, that God is all-knowing, that God is all-powerful, that God is ever-present, that God is ever-faithful, even though we are unfaithful. That God is ever righteous, even when our righteousness is based on our own goodness. God is forever holy when we are sometimes unholy. God's mercy and His grace is part of His excellencies. Part of God's compassion, His love, His benevolence is that excellencies that I find. The note that we just read through earlier is there's about 120 children that come out of battered homes. And the question is, are we going to help them? And that's part of the character of God, where He says, yes, we're going to. If we can, we will extend, we will be benevolent, because that is the excellencies of God. But I want to look at something much more traumatic tonight, and a little bit more dramatic. Come with me to Genesis chapter 45. And you know the story of forgiveness, which is a very, very powerful story. And you'd also know that it is the antitype of Jesus Christ. Genesis 45 contains a very tragic story about the life of a wonderful young man. We will find in the Bible that God hides very few things from us. That's the nice thing about the Bible. It's not like Loving or one of those soapboxes where things are kind of distorted and so on, but it's not disclosed for some sick reason, but it's disclosed to kind of let us look at the raw underlying material within the lives of these people, so that we can clearly discern how God works in the lives of people. We find in the Old Testament that Everybody is presented warts and all. Man, we see a man like Noah, wonderful guy. Dawn, he does the most incredible work in faith. 130 years, there's been no rain. Builds an ark because God told him to. Saves the most essential elements to start the world again. And yet he gets drunk. And we know his behavior is inappropriate. How's about Abram, who lied twice about his wife, Sarah, not being his wife, and literally putting her in harm's way? What if that king committed adultery with her? He would have stood before God, and he knew it. What about Isaac, who followed Abraham's example? What about Jacob, who was a schemer and stole his birthright and his blessing? What about Moses, who tried to excuse himself from serving God? What about David? And I don't need to mention his situation. But Joseph's flaws are much harder to see. We don't see him very clearly, but we don't really believe that he has any flaws. And looking carefully at his life, one often asks the question, why would these people, his brothers, have treated him so badly? Well, a lot of us would say his parents were unwise in the way that hulle het hom bietjie voorgetrek. But let's just go through a few things. He was Israel's favorite son. He was the son of Rachel, the wife that Israel loved. He loved the wife, hence he loved the children, the son. Joseph was treated as his favorite, and we also know that his father then made him this amazing coat made for him, clearly setting him apart from his brothers. Now, if that is not looking for trouble, I don't know what it is, Dawn. If a parent sets alight sibling rivalry, it is just irresponsible. But let's look at this cat's behavior. He's a favored guy and obviously curries favor with his parents, and so he's a little arrogant, we find out when we read the narrative. We also find that he's a bit immature. He moans, he tattletales on his brothers, and there it is. The brothers say, "Ons smaak jou nie, finally you're out of the inner circle." And we find that boonbehalwe al daai goed, he then has a dream of prophecies that he feels compelled to share to everybody. Beside the fact that he's his father's favorite, he's his mother's favorite, he tattletales on his brothers, making them extremely tense. He then tells them, by the way, I've had a wonderful dream that one day I'm going to be your boss. Now, if that's not putting the final nail in the coffin, Carol, I don't know. But this guy goes on and he really causes massive, massive problems. And so his brothers turn around and say, you know what, I think what we do with this cat, we get rid of him, we parcel him off to the Ishmaelites, off you go to Egypt, never to be seen again. But God has another story with his life. And it's interesting how sometimes God has to work with people. And when you read the story, you almost see that this young, arrogant young man, guy that was loved and favored, how God will take him to an environment where he would be toughened and he would have to stand the test all on his own. Well, we know he was a servant of Potiphar, and soon he was his most trusted hand, managed all his affairs, except he could not have access to his wife. Then his wife goes on, Potiphar's wife turns around and accuses him of rape, stays in prison for about 13 years. And we know the story. He's called to come and interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. And then he comes and he rises to fame. We also know the story of betrayal. He spoke to these two guys, the baker and the other guy, and he says, don't worry, we'll come back for you. Once they're out there, forget about him. Isn't that so like the world is? So he felt all of those very, very hard emotions inside those prison cells. But in chapter 45, from verse 1, I want us just to read to verse 3. And Joseph could no longer, when everything became public and his brothers came in front of him, listen carefully to how this story unfolds. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, and he made everybody go out from him. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it as well. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And so they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine had been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all of the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of Egypt. Come down to me and don't make haste. You will dwell in the land of Goshen, and you will be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flock, your herds, and all that you have. And there I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. Here are a few things that we learn from Joseph in the way that he handles the situation, especially how does he get through it. There's a few wonderful principles. We often go to the New Testament when it speaks about reconciliation and forgiveness, but here's a wonderful story that we can learn from. And I'm going to just highlight, I think it's about 5 points in this situation, 5 or 6, and I'll just touch the highlights. Firstly, what we find is that he's an incredibly wise leader. One of the first things he does, he handles the matter privately. The only people that he wants with him is his brothers. He does not call any of the men that report to him. None of the men of Pharaoh's household. Please leave. You've got nothing to do with this matter. It's a family matter. And so often I think when somebody hurts us, we really, really want to tell the world. And it's natural that we want to be validated, that our feelings for feeling hurt and angry is warranted. The second thing from verse 3 and 4 that I find very powerful is that he does not intimidate the offenders. From 3 and 4, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, Come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Isn't that wonderful? What he does is, right there, we are dealing with a very high-ranking official within Egypt who has the power over life and death. And if he had to take their life, no one would have batted an eyelid. But he said, come near me, come near. And that's one part of forgiveness, is that it's completely counterintuitive. Is when everything says, get out of my way, I never want to see you, God's way says, come near to me. The one interesting thing, which has been very scary, is for his brothers being in total dismay. Remember, they kept the secret for years, just between the few of them. No one knew about it. No one knew that what they had done. And he says, come near to me. And then he says to them, is my dad still alive? That must have been scary. Because the implication is the guy that they thought was dead, their problem was away, they were finally the favorite kid on the block. Dad had no favorites. We could all be equal before God. Here he is again. But this time, he's a ruler and he can have power over life and death over us. The third point is he doesn't make them feel guilty. Read in verse 5 and 8 when he says to them, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For years now there had been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. I want you to know that many times when one reads this text, you just see that as time unfolds, the more context and spiritual context and your purpose become clearer, it doesn't matter. God used him to save lives, and that's the purpose. And then he says, so then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, ruler, lord of the entire household, and rulers of all Egypt. What a switch. In other words, he just saw them, Steve, as the instrument. He said, you might have done it for other purposes, but God ultimately was behind your hand, and he sent me here. And it's as if he said, I'm okay with that. The fourth place, seek the good of those who offend. In verse 10 and 11, it says the following: you shall reign in the region of Goshen, live in the region of Goshen, and be near to me, you and your children, and grandchildren, your flocks and your herd, and all that you have, and I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. It's amazing that within Joseph's tremendous heart of goodness, he says, guys, don't stress. We're going to stay together. We'll take care of you because God sent me here to preserve your life and to provide for his people. The fifth one is, he says, forgiveness is a lifelong commitment. Wonderful story. Now, you and I have read this story so many times. The other day while I was reading through it, because when one deals with the hearts of our families, it's very hard sometimes not to then say, look, I'm entitled to hope. It's not true. Just listen to a text from verse 50, chapter 50, from verse 15 to 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, now watch this. Dad's out the way. The full brunt is going to come. What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrong they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When the message came to him, Joseph wept. Wonderful story. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. And Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to him. You see, sometimes people withhold their action because they do not want to hurt the parent. And they were very nervous. But true biblical forgiveness speaks about a lifetime of forgiveness, letting it go despite. And the last one I want to just touch on is we are benefited when we forgive. We find so many people getting sick by unforgiveness. And the 3 reasons that we should forgive is that it is good for us. The second reason for forgiving is that our forgiveness from God depends on it. The most interesting text, and I spoke to somebody a while ago about something. I said, did you realize that when you don't forgive, you are unforgiven? Because your forgiveness is dependent on God. Last one, love. And the last one is, when we forgive, we are like Jesus. Because when you truly forgive and you do not call for any hurt or harm, that's exactly what Jesus did. I hope and pray that the lesson of Joseph would have been meaningful for you. You might have heard it many, many times before. But I pray as we, as God's people, live in a world with increasing animosity between people, communities, families, that we will always, always be the peacemakers.